So this presentation is intended to be a quick overview of some of the things that we talked about in class for our final project in the game design class. And so we're going to build a simple outdoor environment using Unity. And you can get a hold of Unity at unity3d.com and download the free version. Everything I'm doing will be compatible with the free version inside Unity. So I've just installed the latest version of Unity, which is 4.3, and I've launched it, and it came and opened up with this Angry Bots demo. And just a real quick reminder of the interface. To navigate the interface, I'll give you a quick tour of the interface and remind you about how to navigate this environment. On the left side, we have the hierarchy panel, and the hierarchy is going to list everything that's inside our scene environment. If we look at our scene viewport, this is actually just a representation of our 3D or 2D game, depending on what we build. And we have the ability to orbit inside the 3D space by holding down the Option key and clicking and dragging. I can use the mouse wheel to zoom in and zoom out, and if I hold down Option and Command at the same time and click and drag, I can pan. So I'm looking at this through a 3D environment. In the top right-hand corner of the perspective viewport, I have my widget, which will help keep me oriented and show me which direction the axes are pointing. Of course, the y-axis is always pointing up. The x and z axes are going to point back in space, but if you think about a two-dimensional environment, something like Photoshop or Illustrator, we're typically looking at a y-axis as the up axis, and the x-axis is left and right. In a 3D environment, we have the z-axis moving back in space, so I can hold down the Option key, click and drag to orbit around this environment. So I'm looking at the default project that comes with Unity as a demo. I don't want to use this project to get started. So the first thing that I need to do is choose File, New Project, and I need to establish a new project for my island project. And what I'll do is I want to make sure that the Create New Project tab is selected. I'm going to set the location of my new project, and I want to save this to the desktop. So I'll click on my little triangle here to reveal the folder hierarchy. I'm going to click on Desktop, and I'm going to save this project as Bill's Island. Okay, so you can save it with your first name, with Island, or whatever makes sense to you. And on the import following packages list, I'm basically going to check just about everything with the exception of anything that says mobile. So I can see it here, it says Standard Assets Mobile. I'm going to skip that. I'm also going to skip the one that says DirectX 11. Even though we're not going to use all of these assets, I want to make sure that everything is selected. And for the setup defaults for, I want to make sure that that says 3D and not 2D. We'll be making a 3D environment. And I'll hit Create Project. It's prompting me to save any changes that I might have inadvertently made for the demo project. I don't want to save. So now it's creating my island project folder. It'll run through the process of building this project folder. Quick side note, I paused that while the project was building. So it took several minutes for that project to build. So if yours takes a lot longer than mine to build, it's because I did pause the screencast. So once we end up inside Unity with our project built, we'll get started with the process of building a simple terrain. Now, at this point, I'll expect that you reference back to your map project, just as we did in the classroom, and use that for the basic reference. So again, just a real quick tour of the interface. We have our scene, our perspective view here. This is our game scene. Over on the left side, we have a hierarchy panel, and this is going to represent everything that's actually being used currently inside the scene environment. Below that, we have our project tab, and the project tab is associated to the project folder that we just built. So all the assets that are available to us. And when we created our project, we chose to import a bunch of packages, and those are all listed here. And in the event that you missed some of these packages, that's okay, because we can always go to Assets and we can import package. So here's the list of all the things that we created during the project wizard. So if for some reason you missed the water basic, you can always just click on that and it will load dynamically. Over on the right side, we have our inspector, and our inspector is going to give us details for assets that we have selected inside of our scene. So if I select my main camera, you can see that not only can I see the main camera selected inside my scene viewport, but I can also see all the options for it available in the inspector panel. That's the basic overview. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Game Objects, Create Other, and I want to create a terrain game object. This is a very specific kind of object. And once I create that, and I'll just zoom out with my mouse wheel, you can see that I have this big plane. It takes me a while to zoom out. There it is. There's my terrain object, and the terrain is a special kind of object that allows me to sort of sculpt the landscape that I want and add textures to it. Now, I'm holding down the Option Command key, clicking and dragging and zooming in. In the event that you get turned around and pan way far away and get completely lost and can't find your object, if you just double-click on the object in the hierarchy panel, it'll frame it to view. So I'll zoom in just a little bit. Now, before I actually start making my my landscape, I'll remind you of the terrain tools that are over here. So as long as you have the terrain object selected from the hierarchy panel, and if you look over at the inspector panel, inside the terrain script component, there's a set of tools. And the first tool, if I click on that tool, is the raise and lower terrain brush tool. And if I roll my mouse over this, you can see that there's a little blue hotspot. And if I click and start to paint, that will sculpt or lift the terrain object. So I'm kind of sculpting some hills and some mountains here. If I want to adjust the size of the brush, I have a slider here, and the opacity will adjust the strength. So I've just increased the brush size, and I'll continue to paint around. And if I increase the opacity, you'll see that the strength goes up, and I can actually affect this a little bit more aggressively. To the right of that is the Paint Height tool. And the Paint Height tool works very similar to the Raise and Lower Terrain Height tool, with one very big difference, which is that you can set the maximum height for the brush. So if I set the height to 120, and by the way, we're talking about 120 meters, we'll get back to that a little bit later, as I click and paint around, you'll see that the terrain eventually plateaus. So this is a way that we can really kind of control the ultimate height of a surface as it relates to terrains. And so of course I can change that number, and I can set that to 80, which would be lower than the terrain that we just painted, and so I can just go through and continue to paint. Okay, so we have the raise and lower terrain, we have the paint height, and we have similar controls between those two tools. Just to the right of that is the smooth height tool, and what that basically will allow us to do is that when we have transitions, let's say we have some jagged edges that we want to smooth out in our terrain, or we don't have as graceful of a transition from one height to the next, we can just go through and kind of iron those out. So you can see here at a real sharp edge on my landscape, if I come over here, I can just kind of iron all of that out to smooth it out. So you can look at this tool as kind of like an iron tool or something that will smooth out your terrain. To the right of that, we have our Paint Texture tool. And the Paint Texture tool is the way that you apply textures to a terrain. And so what I can do is with that tool selected, I'll go down here and find the Edit Texture button, and I'll choose to add a texture. Once the Add Texture dialog box comes up, I want to find the texture field, it's the one on the left, not normal map, it's the texture, and I'll click on the Select button. From Select, we have the option to choose all of the images that are available to us from our project file. Now, not all of these images will be appropriate to apply to our landscape, and so I'm just scrolling down until I see one that says Good Dirt or Grass Hill or Grass Rock. And these are textures that came inside the terrain assets package that we imported inside Unity. So for some reason, if you do not see these, the Good Dirt, Grass Rock, and they're all in alphabetical order, if you don't see those, I'll just cancel. You can go to Assets, Import Package, and make sure that you've chosen Terrain Assets. Okay? If you don't have those available, they will import once you choose that option. I'll go back to the Paint Texture brush, and I'll choose to Edit Texture, Add Texture, and select the material that I want to use. And I could type in even a search for, I know that one's called Good Dirt, so I'll just type in Good Dirt. I'll select it and say Add. And once I do that, you can see that it inherits that texture that I've selected. If I want to select another texture, I'll click the Edit Texture button and choose Add and hit Select. And I'll go down to grab the Grass Hill texture, and I'll add that. And at this point, if I want to start to paint over top of an existing texture, I can start to blend these together. And so if I click and paint, you can see that nothing is happening, and that's because my new grass texture has not been selected. If I look in the texture swatches here, you can see that Good Dirt is still selected, and I see that it's highlighted blue. Just underneath that means that it's selected, and if I click on the grass texture, at this point now I can just go over here and paint. Just like the previous tools, we can adjust the brush size, we can adjust the opacity, and we can play with the target strength. So if I take the opacity way down, way down, I can paint. Okay, if I take the target strength down, I can paint, and I get kind of a different blending happening here. So you can play with those values. There's a lot of capabilities here with these tools. There's also the tree and place details brush. We'll get back to that a little bit later. And then all the way over to the right are the settings for the terrain. And if I click on that little cogwheel, that will reveal the settings for this terrain, and we can set all kinds of different parameters. And the one that's really important is the resolution. The terrain width, the terrain length, and the terrain height. We can set the maximum width, length, and height of this terrain. And as I mentioned in class, a 2,000 meter map is very, very big. And so once we start walking around inside our environment, we're very quickly, we're going to get bored because things are going to be so spread out, so far apart. And so I'm going to recommend that we take this down to about, roughly 1,000 meters in both the width and the length. And I'll hit return, and that makes the map about 1/4 of the size that it was to begin with. Okay. Now, in the event that I want to change this map and really start creating it based on the sketch that I've made, I have two options. I can delete the terrain that I'm working on and create a new one. Or what I could do is I could go to the Paint Height tool and hit Flatten. Now when I flatten that map out, I'll Command Z to undo. Of course, I flatten that map, and I can start painting new textures on it. So I could flatten the map. If I go to the Texture tool and I want to get rid of a texture, I can simply select the texture and choose Edit Textures and remove the texture, and that texture will be removed from the landscape. Okay, I'll undo that because I want that texture back and I want access to it. So at this point, again, I can go back in and I can start to paint. Now, my goal is to paint a map. I don't actually have the example of the map, so I'll do just a real quick sketch inside Miro here in DeviantArt. So this is the basic shape of the landscape that I want to create, kind of a big C shape. And inside this cove, I want to have some kind of island element that looks like it broke free from the island that's going to include a volcano element. And this will be a point of interest, and this volcano will be, kind of spewing out smoke, and maybe dropping some lava as it goes, and this will be a point of interest. My user is going to start over here on the island and have to make their way around the mysterious island and explore the landscape to get over to the point where they can hop across a couple of rocks that take them up closer to this point of interest. That's the overall concept. I'll come up with a name for my island and really kind of push the narrative a little bit further with some of the aspects that I integrate into it. But that's the basic strategy here for my map. So in the next presentation, I'll work on translating that basic concept into Unity. We'll take a deeper dive into some of the tools that are available. And so take this as an opportunity to download Unity, get it up and running, experiment with navigating in a 3D space, and build your first terrain to experiment. And we'll catch up in the next presentation.